In this presentation, we'll talk a little bit about rhetoric, a powerful tool for writing. By the end of this presentation, you should be able to define rhetoric, discuss the history of rhetoric, list and describe Aristotle's three means of persuasion, ethos, pathos, and logos, and list and describe the first three steps of composing a written work, determining purpose, audience, and tone. Let's get started by defining our course. The title of our course is Composition and Rhetoric. Most of us already know that the term composition means the manner in which something is composed or put together. All writing is composed, whether it be a novel, a poem, an email, or a research paper. In other words, the first part of our course consists of putting together words and sentences in a particular order using a particular format. Rhetoric, on the other hand, may be a concept that you're not quite as familiar with. Let's look at the definition of this term. Rhetoric is the art of discourse wherein a writer or speaker strives to inform, persuade, or motivate particular audiences in specific situations. From this definition, we can see that rhetoric can be used not only in writing, but also in speeches, advertisements, political campaigns, and even everyday conversations. We also see from this definition that rhetoric has a particular purpose, to inform, persuade, or motivate, and that it's used with particular audiences in mind that are in specific situations. For example, a political advertisement on TV may attempt to persuade you to vote for a particular candidate during an election. An ad on social media may try to get you to purchase a product, and you might try to convince your professor to give you an A on an assignment. The history of rhetoric goes back a long time. One of the earliest known publications on rhetoric dates back to around 386 BCE with Plato's Gorgias, in which he calls rhetoric a disgrace, claiming that it aims at the pleasant and ignores the best. Even today, rhetoric is sometimes viewed negatively. For example, a politician may be said to be all rhetoric and no substance, meaning that he might be very good at making speeches, but may not follow through with his promises. It's important to note, though, that rhetoric can be used as a persuasive tool to do good in this world, too. In Phaedrus, Plato gives rhetoric some credit, saying that in the hands of an experienced philosopher, rhetoric is like winning the soul through discourse. Aristotle studied at Plato's Academy. In the 4th century BCE, he published his work Rhetoric, which most scholars believe to be the great foundation of the study of rhetoric and persuasion. In fact, Aristotle believed that rhetoric was one of the three key elements of philosophy. Focusing more on speech than writing, he described three means of persuasion: ethos, pathos, and logos. Ethos is known as the ethical appeal. Before you can persuade a reader to take your side on an argument, you must convince him or her that what you're saying or writing is true. In other words, your audience needs to trust you. The following factors work to appeal to your reader's ethical side. In order to believe that what you're writing is true, your audience must believe that you have a good moral reputation. The National Enquirer, for example, is known for publishing scandalous articles on celebrities that are generally far from the truth. This newspaper, therefore, has a bad reputation for lying to its audience in order to make sales, a very unethical act. Another example of a source that lacks ethos is InfoWars, a far-right website that promotes pseudoscience and conspiracy theories. To appeal to your audience's ethical side, be sure to always use factual evidence as support and avoid using biased sources. To be convincing, it's also important for readers to believe that you have their best interests in mind. For example, Donald Trump made many false claims regarding the 2019 coronavirus outbreak, stating that it would disappear, promoting treatments that had not yet been proven to work, and discouraging for a long time the use of masks, leading many Americans to lose trust in him. Your audience wants to feel like they can trust that what they're reading is intended to be beneficial to them and possibly to humanity as a whole. For this purpose, you should always avoid sharing misinformation. Additionally, you can gain your audience's trust by thoroughly researching your topic. Readers will be likelier to trust a writer who appears to be well informed on the topic that is being discussed. Including and discussing opposing points of view in your argument is one way to show that you've done your research. Using a variety of reliable sources that are up to date to support your view is another. In a nutshell, using ethos in your rhetoric is important because your audience expects you to be fair, reasonable, knowledgeable, trustworthy, honest, and morally sound. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all saw pathos, or the emotional appeal, as used far too often for manipulation. When used in combination with ethos and logos, however, pathos can be very convincing. Rousseau said, "We felt before we thought." Appealing to your audience's emotions can be a very potent way to convince them to take your side. Pictures or descriptions of sad, starving children, for example, is an easy way to persuade people to donate to a charity. Strong wording or passionate delivery can pull at the audience's heartstrings or stoke other emotions such as fear and anger. Emotional appeals are often used in politics to attract potential voters. Consider Donald Trump's use of scare tactics in the 2020 election. To convince people to vote for him, he has stressed the importance of law and order in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests and warns that having a Democrat in office will result in mob control and cities being burnt to the ground. Don't let this fool you. Always consult a variety of sources so that you can get the full picture on the subject being addressed. Pathos can be very convincing when used the right way. A Subaru commercial that focuses on sad parents sending their teenager away to college might touch the audience's heart and persuade them that they should buy a Subaru because they are safe and reliable. Be careful to use a good deal of ethos and logos, fact-based arguments, when using emotional appeals, however. An essay or speech dominated by emotion can make your readers feel like they're being tricked. Finally, to be persuasive, an argument needs a good helping of logic and reason through the use of logos, or the logical appeal. It can be argued that logos should be the most frequently used appeal when writing an academic essay. A rational appeal uses logic to convince an audience that what is being said is both true and reasonable. A logical argument is built on premises, or claims that lead to the argument's conclusion. When presenting an argument, we should always provide reasons and fact-based evidence to support our claims. For example, you might argue that the federal minimum wage should be raised because it would address long-standing racial inequities, citing a study that demonstrates the percentages of minorities that would benefit from the raise. In this example, your claim is that raising minimum wage would address long-standing racial inequities, and your evidence is the study that shows how minorities would benefit. Examples of evidence that you could use to support your claims are statistics, peer-reviewed studies, statements or interviews from subject matter experts, proven facts, surveys, polls, questionnaires, experiments, observations, charts and other visuals, and more. When using logos, it's important to watch out for fallacies, or errors in logic that lead to faulty reasoning. One example is the slippery slope fallacy, which contends that if one thing happens, it will inevitably lead to a chain of events that end in disaster. For example, in regards to the recent removal of Confederate statues, Trump has said, "This week it's Robert E. Lee. I noticed that Stonewall Jackson's coming down. I wonder, is it George Washington next week, and is it Thomas Jefferson the week after? You know, you really do have to ask yourself, where does it stop?" In other words, Trump presents the slippery slope that one thing, the removal of Confederate statues, will inevitably lead to something really drastic, the tearing down of monuments to the Founding Fathers, which is an argument that doesn't really have any evidence to support it. Though some of the Founding Fathers did own slaves and should be criticized for it, Confederate statues are being removed because Confederate leaders are honored specifically for protecting slavery. In this case, one thing does not necessarily lead to the other. Watch out for fallacies like these and be sure to avoid using them in your own arguments. Next, we'll talk a little bit about considering purpose, audience, and tone. Returning back to our definition of rhetoric, we can see that a good argument takes two things into consideration: a particular audience and a specific situation. As an example, let's say that a student wants to write an email to convince a professor to let her take an exam late due to an emergency with her daughter. The first thing she would do before composing her email is determine her situation or purpose for writing. Some of the most common purposes for writing are to describe, to inform, to entertain, to compare and contrast, to explain, to persuade, to define, and to analyze. In this example, the student's purpose is to persuade her professor to let her take an exam late. Next, she needs to analyze her audience. In this case, she is writing to one person, her professor. She knows that her professor has a strict late policy in the syllabus, but she also considers the fact that her professor said on the first day of class that students should always talk to her if issues come up that affect their ability to complete their work. She believes that her professor is both reasonable and kind-hearted. These are all details about her audience that she needs to consider before composing her email. Finally, she needs to consider what tone she should use to compose her email. She knows that since she's writing a professional in academics, she should use proper grammar and spelling, and avoid using text message spellings and abbreviations. She knows that she should be formal, but not too stuffy. After all, she's trying to convince her professor that she's a regular person who sometimes experiences unexpected problems in life that can't be helped. Once she's considered her purpose, audience, and tone, she's ready to start writing her email. She'll probably try to appeal to the professor's emotional side by including details about how her daughter got sick and had to go to the emergency room. And she'll appeal to her ethical side by including a doctor's note as an attachment to the email. Now think about how a written work might change for different situations with different purposes and audiences. For example, if you wanted to explain the weather to a 6-year-old, you would probably use short words, easy-to-grasp concepts, and simple, relatable experiences to get your point across. If your purpose was to persuade your boss that you need a new computer, you would probably use language that is formal, professional, and concise, avoiding the emotional appeal here, since it probably wouldn't be appropriate. If your purpose was to describe your birthday night out to your friends, you might use more casual and informal language, using slang, text abbreviations, and emojis as you see fit. In this presentation, we discussed the definition of rhetoric, the history of rhetoric, Aristotle's 3 means of persuasion, ethos, pathos, and logos, and the first 3 steps of composing a written work, determining purpose, audience, and tone. Thanks for watching!